Well, sorry you couldn't make it to the Chesapeake Bay trip, but if you follow along this presentation, it'll be just like you were there. So I hope you enjoy. The day starts with a look at maps. Here we're looking at a map of the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and students are trying to find out what they can learn from a map like this. This map is a political map, and Gerard and Brad are looking at this to determine what states are in the Chesapeake Bay watershed and what kind of rivers are found in the Chesapeake watershed as well. Our educator for the day is Melissa, and here she goes over with Dwayne about the map and what he's learned from just examining the rivers and areas in the map itself. After looking at the maps, the students play a game called Stumper, in which they try to ask questions of the other students that can be answered using the maps, but would stump them. You can see from the yellow arrow here that a couple of the rivers are turned brown on this map. And that's because there was a rainstorm right before the picture was taken, and all that sediment's washing down the Potomac and the Rappahannock rivers. It's really instrumental and probably something we'll see on this trip anyway after the hurricane. After we left the map activity, we left the tobacco barn and found this rain garden. A rain garden is something that you plant at the bottom of a rain spout or downspout to collect rainwater, and you can grow crops or plants or flowers there. It's a great way of controlling water that could otherwise go into sewers or run off the land. Our other guy was Julia, and you can see here we just grabbed some tools and headed to the fields. On the way to the fields, we stopped with another activity regarding runoff. And here Melissa is explaining the different types of land use that they are mimicking here on this hill. There is urban land use, suburban lawn, crops, forest, and a couple of different agricultural methods called strip cropping, which we'll look at the effects of runoff in a moment. So Melissa and Julia watered each type of land use for 5 minutes. And then at the end of each kind of test area is a jug, and that jug collects all the water that runs off that type of land use. So we're looking at the urban land use first, and you can see that the water in the jug is brown. And we talked about why that brown water occurs. It's a result of sediment and dirt washing off our roads and our back lots and homes and roofs. And there's nothing to stop it because there's no vegetation in urban areas. So all that ends up in the waterways. And that sediment's not good for the Chesapeake Bay because it covers organisms that rely on sunlight, and it also can smother organisms that's in the bottom that can't move. So sediment's not a good thing for the bay, and urban areas are a big cause of that kind of sediment pollution. The next type of land use we investigated was the suburban lawn, and you can see here that the water is technicolor yellow, and that's to represent the nutrients that run off of our lawns as we put fertilizers on them. There's no complex vegetation like shrubs and trees of any great number to absorb some of this pollution, and so all those nutrients that run off our lawns end up in the Chesapeake Bay. And there, algae and other organisms can use those nutrients. When algae blooms, it can block out sunlight for other organisms that live on the bottom, like grasses. And when all that algae die, the bacteria that consume it on the bottom of the bay can consume all the oxygen in an area. And when all the oxygen is consumed in an area, we say that part of the bay becomes eutrophic. And that means that any organisms like fish and crabs that require oxygen don't have enough to survive. We commonly call those areas dead zones. In this photo, you can see the pits where the water collection containers are kept. It's a great place to find mice and a lot of black widow spiders. So the next type of land use we investigated was an agricultural technique called conservation tillage. And in this case, instead of tilling up crops every year, farmers leave the crops in the ground and just harvest the corn or whatever from the top of them. And then they plant new crops right on top of them. It never exposes the soil. You don't have a lot of sediment that gets released. And so the water runs off, but it doesn't run off in that brown color we saw in the urban land use. The last type of land use that we compared was a forest. And if you look at the comparison of conservation tillage agriculture on the left and the funnel on the right, you'll see the funnel on the right has hardly any water in it at all. And that's because forests with trees and other vegetation are wonderful at soaking up runoff, and not much water runs off at all. So forests are definitely our preferred type of land use if we're going to prevent erosion and water and nutrients and sediments from getting into the Chesapeake Bay. That's why people promote planting forest buffers or riparian buffers near streams and waterways to help collect some of that sediment before it gets to the bay. So after our water experiment, it was off to the farm. And this Clagget farm area is not only an educational center, but it's an actual working organic farm. So there's lots to be done and learned on a farm. Here some guys are turning over some of the soil so we can plant some cover crops on an exposed patch of earth where some crops had been grown during the previous growing season. Some of those crops included chili peppers, and man, were these hot. Another educator, Julia, helped us pull up some of the corn stalks that were left over from the year's harvest. One of the interesting plants we found was a bean plant, which is in the legume family. Legumes are unique in that they can fix nitrogen. They can take nitrogen gas that winds its way through the air spaces into the soil, and they can convert that nitrogen into nitrates, an inorganic form of nitrogen that all plants need. And they're one of the very few groups of plants that can do this. They do it through the use of bacteria that actually live in nodules on their roots. And if you look very closely at Melissa's hand here, as she's holding it, you'll see there's a little yellow nodule right by her finger, and you can see that that's where the bacteria would live and where they do their nitrogen fixation. It's a very important part of the nitrogen cycle, as we'll learn, and a very important part of keeping the soil healthy. Legumes replace nitrogen in the soil, whereas most other plants remove nitrogen. And nitrogen is an essential nutrient for a lot of plant survival. In the end, all the plants that we uprooted after the harvest went to compost. Not to mention all the food that we ate during this week, all the scraps and peels and all the parts of the vegetables that we ate also went to compost as well. It's a great way of reusing the materials that come from the earth, putting them back into the earth as nutrients for plants rather than using inorganic fertilizer. So after dealing with some plants, it was time to meet some animals. And so our group went to the cow pasture. And here we met the Chesapeake Bay Foundation's herd of Angus cows. And these cows are beef cattle that are grazed on grass only. And they fetch a nice price for being grass-fed beef. The Chesapeake Bay Foundation sells them at auction every year and keeps the calves every year to replace the ones that are slaughtered. If you look closer, you can see this cow's adding some nutrients to the pasture. The area where he's standing doesn't have any vegetation there, and that's because they're under a tree where it's shady and they have kind of stomped and pawed the ground and removed it. But normally all of their pastures are lush, like the grass behind it. And that's because the cows only spend 3 days in any one pasture, and then they're moved on. There are about 18 to 24 pastures here at the farm, and the cows are rotated around, so they never remove all the grass in a certain pasture, and their waste never builds up on a certain field, so the field can't absorb the nutrients. This method of moving cows around is called rotational grazing, and it solves a number of problems. It solves the nutrient problem because cows make lots of waste. It spreads it out on the farm, and it solves the problem of maintaining a field of grass. The cows never deplete the grass, especially the clover, until it's gone and there's nothing but bare dirt underneath of it, at least not in areas that aren't shady like this one. It also means that there are some costs. It means that you need more space to do this, so tiny farms, this is an option. The farm was great, but now it's time to look a little bit downriver and see what we can find at the Patuxent River, which you see here with a flock of geese taking off. The Patuxent River is a tributary of the Chesapeake Bay, and the creeks and areas that we just inhabited on the farm all run into the Patuxent River as well. So we can kind of see some of the collective effects of farms and developments all around the Patuxent, like we just visited, as we canoe down the Patuxent to Mattaponi Creek. First, a paddling lesson. You'd think that wouldn't be necessary, but it's always good to review. Behind these guys is Selby's Landing, and if you can think about it, this is an old tobacco landing. Right here at this dock, ships would have come in, yes, ships would have come in to collect barrels of tobacco that were grown in southern Maryland. Today, there's so much sediment in Patuxent River that a ship could hardly make it through. If you look behind the guys there and look at the marsh with the yellow flowers and everything, none of that was there during the 1700s when ships navigated the Patuxent River for tobacco. After our canoe lesson, it was time to launch canoes. And you can see Brad carefully getting in here. His partner's holding the canoe down, and this is a great way to make sure you don't go in the water when you're canoeing. The Patuxent River and Mattaponi Creek are on a protected area called the Jug Bay Nature Preserve and Patuxent River Park. And they also border the Merkle Wildlife Sanctuary. It's a beautiful place to find birds, have a quiet paddle, go into the marshes, and relax. Every time I'm there, I just kind of forget all the things that are going on back home, and I can just focus on the beauty around me. And as many times as I've been there, it changes every time. It's a wonderful place. Here the guys take a little break in the spatter dock. Spatter dock isn't large enough in the spring to even see, so this area would just look like the surface of the water in April or May. But now come September, October, the spatter dock has grown quite large. It's one of the only plants that can tolerate being submerged, and so its roots hold the mud together and kind of form mud banks, and it forms a beautiful yellow flower in these meadows here. And it also has hollow stems that if you break one and look inside of it, you can see the many tubes that it uses to conduct water up and down from its roots to its leaves. The natives used to call this spatter dock plant duckcorn because it forms a little kind of pod inside of little kernels. The kernels are surrounded by a gel that's very, very sticky, and the ducks like to eat it. So sometimes you're canoeing along and find an unexpected piece of wildlife. So here, right in the middle of this picture on that stick, if you look very closely, is an eastern water snake. These snakes are actually very aggressive, and if you're watching this on YouTube and you go to my YouTube page, Mr. Biology to You is my name there, you can find a video of one of these eastern water snakes eating a perch from a previous trip. It's quite a dramatic event. Melissa's found some of that duckcorn. She shows us one of those pods there. It's actually overripe at the moment and not so sticky. That's why she's touching it. We canoed up Mattaponi Creek to this bridge, and going a little farther, we would have really run aground because beavers have dammed the creek just upriver from us here, and we can't get through at low tide. So we're stopping just for a moment to kind of reflect and look at things. You can see Gerard is having a great time on this. This picture actually made it into Blakefield's magazine last year. But this is a great way station. Later on in the evening, we come back to the bridge and kind of relax and listen to the frogs. It's a very cool spot. After we returned from our canoe, we want to look under the water to see how healthy the ecosystem is, because it looked beautiful from above, but what's really living here? So the guys got out the seine, which is French for net, so seine net's kind of redundant. You can see the top has floats and the bottom has these metal weights, lead weights, and that keeps the net kind of stretched out in the water, and the guys use the poles to guide the net through the water and see what they can catch. This does require you to get wet, so the guys are wearing waders, but sometimes water goes over the top if you're not careful. Mr. O'Hara and Chris kind of show the correct technique here for stretching the net out and angling it towards shore. And lo and behold, pull the net in, we've got something. We collected all of the fish and shrimp and things we found in the net, put them in a bucket for later examination. As the guy is saying, I took notice of some of the park regulations there. This pier is a popular spot for fishermen, but there's a poster there advocating using barbless hooks so that fishermen can practice catch and release with minimal damage to fish. They're also limited in the watercraft they can use, and so even though this is a boat launch, you can't bring in your big boat in this location. Here you can see an old animal cracker tub serves as a great little temporary aquarium, and we've got a number of fish that we've caught in here. Melissa and Julia would later help us identify these, and we determined there was probably about 7 or 8 species in this little creek of all different types, so bottom dwellers as well as surface feeders. A good sign. After the biological sampling, we also did a little bit of water quality testing so we could compare this creek with the next day's trip to the bay. What Gerard and Brad are using here is a Secchi disc, a disc that we put in the water and we see how far down we can extend it before we lose sight of it. And you can see there they have their fingers on that location, which is only about a foot. So the murkiness and sediment in the water wasn't too good. And we were surprised we found so many fish despite the bad visibility. So Melissa and Julia explained how certain fish occupy different zones and different habitats. It was a neat exercise to learn that many different species of fish could inhabit the same place because they don't occupy the same niche. A niche is the role that a fish plays, and if it eats different things or lives in different spaces, it can kind of live in the same habitat without competing. At the end of the day, we had a small group, but you can see that the 8 of us were in good spirits. The sun came out, and we had a pose for a great picture here on Selby's Landing at the Patuxent River. So looking forward to a great day, but the next thing we have to do is set up camp. Camp went up pretty quickly. Dinner would follow. You can see our campfire there on the right was a nice unwinding spot after our night hike here at Patuxent River Park. So, that's the end of day 1. Got too dark to take pictures and I got busy doing dinner, which was a delicious chili and cornbread dinner. And I can't wait to have it again. So, I hope you enjoyed seeing what we did on day 1. Hope it gave you some topics to think about as we explored. And stay tuned for day 2.